Deep in the Cascade Mountains, where cell towers can't reach and rescue helicopters never fly, Eleanor Thorne drove the final nail into her winter shelter just as the first blizzard began. She'd survived 43 winters alone on this mountain, but she'd never built anything on the old ceremonial grounds before. The Chinook elders had warned her grandmother about this place, but Eleanor thought those were just stories. She was wrong. The first night, she heard scratching from inside the walls. The second night, the scratching became whispers in a language that made her teeth ache. By the third night, dark stains began seeping through the wood, and she realized the shelter wasn't keeping the cold out. It was keeping something else in. Eleanor wasn't just any mountain hermit. She was a former FBI paranormal investigator who'd fled to these mountains after witnessing horrors that destroyed her sanity. Now those same investigative instincts were screaming one terrifying truth: she'd accidentally built a prison, and she was locked inside with the prisoner. But what exactly had been waiting beneath the ground for someone foolish enough to build on sacred soil? Eleanor pressed her weathered palm against the bleeding wood, feeling warmth pulse beneath her fingertips like a heartbeat. The liquid was too dark for sap, too viscous for water. In her FBI days, she'd seen enough crime scenes to recognize blood when she saw it. But this was different. This blood moved with purpose, forming patterns that shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. The wind howled outside, but the sounds from within the walls had nothing to do with the storm. Something was moving between the timber and the insulation she'd carefully laid just 3 days ago. Something that breathed in rhythm with her own lungs, as if learning to mimic her vital signs. She'd chosen this spot for practical reasons. The natural depression in the earth provided wind protection, and the ring of ancient trees offered additional shelter from the elements. The fact that these trees stood in a perfect circle, their trunks bearing old scars from long-ago fires, should have been her first warning. The way no animals came near this place should have been her second. Eleanor lit her kerosene lamp with steady hands, muscle memory from decades of isolation keeping her movements calm despite the fear crawling up her spine. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment the shadows seemed to dance back. The scratching started again, but now she could pinpoint its location. Whatever was making the noise was moving along the eastern wall, following the beam where she'd found the bones. She'd discovered them while digging the foundation 3 weeks ago. Small bones, arranged in deliberate patterns around what looked like a stone altar buried just 2 feet below the surface. Any reasonable person would have stopped building and chosen another location, but Eleanor had lost her grip on reasonable thinking long before she'd fled to these mountains. The bones were old, older than the forest around them. They'd been wrapped in rotted cloth and tied with sinew that crumbled at her touch. She should have reburied them with respect, should have honored whatever sacred purpose they'd once served. Instead, she'd collected them in a coffee can and used them to fill gaps in her foundation, thinking they were just animal remains. Now something was trying to communicate with her, and the message was becoming clearer with each passing hour. The whispers had started as formless sounds, but tonight she could almost make out words. They spoke of earth and root and bone, of ceremonies interrupted and spirits displaced. Eleanor's trained mind catalogued the phenomena with clinical precision, even as terror threatened to overwhelm her. The temperature inside the shelter was rising despite the blizzard outside. The air tasted metallic, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl, and beneath it all was a smell she recognized from her worst cases, the scent of something ancient and predatory that had been sleeping far too long. She'd investigated 12 paranormal cases during her FBI career before her breakdown. Each one had taught her that supernatural entities followed rules, even if those rules defied conventional logic. This thing, whatever it was, had been contained by the sacred nature of this ground, held in check by ceremonies and respect that had been maintained for generations. By building here, by using the bones as fill, she'd broken that containment. Worse, she'd created a new prison with herself as the only occupant. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that froze her blood, breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations coming from directly behind her. Eleanor turned slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at her hip. The weapon had been her constant companion for 15 years, but she had a sinking feeling that bullets wouldn't help her now. The corner where she'd stacked her supplies was empty, but the breathing continued. Something invisible stood 3 feet away, watching her with attention that felt like ice water in her veins. The bleeding started 3 days after the first snowfall. Sarah woke to the metallic scent of copper hanging thick in the recycled air of her shelter. She'd grown accustomed to the musty smell of earth and timber, the faint smokiness from her small wood stove, but this was different. This made her stomach clench with primal recognition. In the pale morning light filtering through her single window, dark rivulets traced crooked paths down the eastern wall. The stains were fresh, still glistening, seeping from between the logs she'd so carefully chinked, with moss and mud just weeks before. Sarah pressed her palm against one of the wet streaks. The liquid was warm, viscous, and undeniably blood. But whose and how? She'd built these walls herself, knew every inch of timber, every gap she'd sealed. There were no animals trapped inside, no explanation for the crimson tears weeping from the wood. She grabbed a rag and began wiping at the stains, but they spread faster than she could clean them. The blood seemed to well up from within the logs themselves, as if the very trees were hemorrhaging. The cloth in her hands grew sodden and heavy, the metallic smell intensifying until she had to step back, fighting the urge to vomit. "What the hell?" she whispered to the empty room. The shelter fell silent except for the soft drip, drip, drip of blood hitting the floorboards. That night, the whispers began. Sarah jolted awake in her sleeping bag, heart hammering against her ribs. The fire had died to embers, casting everything in shifting orange shadows. She lay perfectly still, listening. There it was again, a soft susurrus of voices just beyond the edge of comprehension. Multiple voices, layered and urgent, speaking in a language that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her bones. The whispers were coming from inside the walls. She fumbled for her flashlight, the beam wavering as her hands shook. The voices grew clearer as she approached the bleeding wall, though the words remained unintelligible. They sounded old, impossibly old, carrying the weight of centuries in their cadence. Some pleading, some angry, all desperate. Sarah pressed her ear to the wood, and the whispers stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence she could hear something else, a rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging against wood from the inside. She jerked back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam caught movement in her peripheral vision, and she spun toward the opposite wall. For just a moment she could have sworn she saw handprints pressing outward from within the logs, fingers splayed against the interior surface, as if someone were trapped inside, pushing against their wooden prison. But when she steadied the light, there was nothing. Just more blood, now seeping from every wall of her shelter. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the bleeding had worsened overnight, pooling in the corners where the walls met the floor. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet and cloying, and wrong. Sarah's head pounded as she tried to think rationally about what was happening. She'd researched this land extensively before buying it, hadn't she? The realtor had been eager to sell, she remembered now. Too eager. The price had been absurdly low for 40 acres of pristine mountain wilderness. When she'd asked why, he'd muttered something about the previous owner wanting to wash his hands of the place after his grandfather's death. Sarah wished she'd asked more questions. She spent the day trying to escape the shelter, but 3 feet of fresh snow had fallen during the night, and more was coming down in thick, heavy flakes. Her snowshoes were somewhere under the white blanket outside, and even if she could find them, she knew she'd never make it down the mountain in these conditions. The nearest road was 8 miles through treacherous terrain, and her cell phone had been useless up here from day one. She was trapped until the weather cleared. As afternoon faded to evening, the voices returned with renewed intensity. This time, she caught fragments that seemed almost familiar, not words she recognized, but sounds that echoed in some deep ancestral memory. They spoke of hunger and darkness, of long years spent waiting, of promises made and broken. And they spoke of her. Sarah's name drifted through the whispers like smoke, pronounced in that ancient tongue with unmistakable longing. Whatever was in these walls, it knew she was here. It had been waiting for her or someone like her for a very long time. The scratching intensified as night fell, now coming from every wall simultaneously. Sarah huddled by the dying fire, flashlight clutched in white-knuckled fingers, watching the blood continue its relentless seepage. The handprints were clearer now, dozens of them pressing against the interior of the logs, some large, some heartbreakingly small. She understood now why the land had been so cheap, why the previous owner had been so eager to sell. She'd built her shelter on cursed ground, and now something that should have stayed buried was waking up, something that was very, very hungry. The bleeding started 3 days after the walls went up. Sarah first noticed it while boiling pine needle tea over her small camp stove. A single crimson drop landed in the steaming water with a soft plop, spreading like watercolor paint through the amber liquid. She looked up at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, expecting to see a wounded bird or perhaps evidence of some animal that had taken shelter in the eaves. Nothing. The wood above her head was dry and unstained, showing only the natural grain patterns she'd memorized during construction. Yet as she watched, another drop formed seemingly from nowhere and fell, this time landing on her outstretched palm. The liquid was warm and metallic, unmistakably blood. She grabbed her flashlight and examined every inch of the ceiling, then the walls, searching for a source. The logs were solid, properly chinked with mud and moss. No gaps large enough for an injured animal to hide within, no stains or discoloration that might explain the mysterious bleeding. By evening, the drops had become a steady drip. Sarah positioned her largest pot beneath the spot, listening to the rhythmic ping-ping-ping that echoed through the small space. She tried to convince herself it was tree sap, perhaps reddened by minerals in the soil. Mountain folk knew that wood could weep strange things, especially when freshly cut. But sap didn't smell like copper pennies. Sap didn't make her stomach clench with primitive recognition. That night she lay in her sleeping bag listening to the drops fall, each one marking time like a metronome. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, the sound changed. The sharp pings became soft splashes, as if the liquid was thickening. In the morning, she found the pot filled with something that looked like congealed blood but smelled of earth and decay. She dumped it outside, far from the shelter, and watched the dark mass disappear into the snow. Within minutes, the white surface began to steam and bubble where the substance had fallen, releasing a sulphurous odor that made her eyes water. The whispers began that same day. At first, Sarah thought it was wind moving through gaps in her construction. Mountain winters were notorious for finding every weakness in a structure, exploiting the smallest spaces to create haunting sounds. She spent hours searching for drafts, stuffing additional moss and mud into any crevices she could find. But the whispers continued, seeming to come from within the walls themselves. They spoke no language she recognized, yet somehow she understood their hunger. The voices layered over one another in a symphony of want, growing louder when she moved near the western wall, where she'd found that strange circle of stones. That wall now wept blood constantly, the dark liquid tracing intricate patterns down the wood grain like some obscene calligraphy. On the fourth night, Sarah woke to find words carved into the eastern wall. Deep gouges in the wood spelled out symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than her eyes could process. She knew she hadn't carved them. The marks were too precise, too alien, and they seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. She tried to sand them away the next morning, but the symbols only grew deeper with each pass of the rough paper. The wood began to bleed more freely as she worked, until red rivulets ran down her arms and stained her clothes. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, no longer content to murmur. They demanded, they commanded, they promised terrible things in exchange for terrible favors. Sarah dropped the sandpaper and backed away from the wall. The bleeding stopped immediately, and the whispers faded to their usual susurrus. Whatever was trapped here with her was learning, responding to her actions, growing stronger. She considered abandoning the shelter, but where could she go? The nearest town was 40 miles through mountain wilderness, and winter had truly arrived. The snow now fell steadily, already knee-deep around her sanctuary. Even if she could make the journey, what would she tell people? That her winter shelter was haunted, that something ancient was seeping through the walls like infection through a wound. They'd think her mad. Mountain hermits were already viewed with suspicion, and Sarah had worked too hard to build even the grudging respect she'd earned from the locals. She couldn't risk losing that for what might simply be cabin fever and isolation playing tricks on her mind. But that night, as she lay listening to blood drip into her collection of pots and pans, Sarah knew this was no psychological break. Something real lived in these walls now. Something that had been waiting beneath that stone circle for longer than human memory could reach. She'd built her shelter on top of a prison, and her construction had cracked the bars just enough for the prisoner to begin squeezing through. The bleeding was just the beginning. The bleeding started during the third night. Clara had managed to convince herself that the whispers were just wind, finding new ways through the gaps in her hastily constructed walls. Mountain air had always been tricky, full of currents and eddies that could make the most seasoned climber paranoid. But when she woke to find dark rivulets streaming down the interior walls like tears from invisible wounds, rationalization became impossible. The liquid was warm to the touch and smelled of copper and decay. It wasn't sap. She'd checked the logs twice, running her hands along every inch of timber. No insect bore holes, no obvious damage. The bleeding seemed to seep directly from the wood itself, as if the trees remembered something terrible and were finally able to weep for it. Clara pressed her back against the door, the only surface that remained dry. Her lantern cast dancing shadows that made the crimson streams appear to move with purpose, flowing in patterns that hurt to follow with her eyes. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language that predated words, communicating in tones that bypassed her ears and went straight to the primitive parts of her brain. Something was testing the walls. She'd felt it first as subtle vibrations through the floorboards, like a large animal circling the shelter. But the movement was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Whatever stalked the perimeter was intelligent, patient. It probed for weaknesses with the methodical precision of a predator that had learned to wait. The temperature inside the shelter had begun to fluctuate wildly. One moment she'd be shivering despite her heavy coat, the next she'd find herself sweating as an unnatural heat radiated from the bleeding walls. The air itself seemed thick, oppressive, as if the space was slowly filling with something other than oxygen. Clara's water had turned brackish on the second day. Her food now tasted of earth and ash, though the packages remained sealed. Even her own saliva had taken on a metallic tang that made swallowing an act of will. The shelter was changing her from the inside out, rewriting the basic chemistry of her existence. The first attempt had been methodical. She'd gathered her essential supplies, checked her compass, and pulled open the door to face the blizzard. But the landscape beyond was wrong. Where there should have been familiar ridgelines and the distant glow of the valley below, she'd found only an endless expanse of white, stretching into a colorless void. No horizon, no reference points, just an infinite nothing that made her eyes water and her balance falter. The second attempt had been born of desperation. She'd shouldered through the door without looking, keeping her eyes fixed on her boots as she trudged forward through snow that felt oddly warm against her legs, but after what seemed like hours of walking, she'd looked up to find herself standing outside the shelter again, as if the path had curved back on itself in defiance of geography. Now she sat with her back pressed against the door, afraid to try again. The whispers had grown stronger since her failed escapes, more triumphant. They knew she understood. Whatever had been waiting in this place, whatever had made the land itself hunger, it had been patient for so long that a few more days meant nothing. The logs groaned around her, not from wind or settling, but as if they were slowly bending inward. The shelter was contracting, imperceptibly but inevitably. She'd begun marking the walls with her knife, scratching reference points to track the movement. Each morning the marks were closer together. Clara pulled out her journal, the one item that still seemed untouched by the wrongness saturating everything else. Her handwriting had become erratic, letters slanting in directions that defied the ruled lines. She wrote by lantern light, documenting each new impossibility as if recording them might somehow make them manageable. Day 4. The walls are breathing now, slow, deep respirations that make the whole structure flex like a rib cage. I can feel a heartbeat through the floor when I press my palm against it, something vast and patient, beating maybe once every few minutes. The whispers are teaching me words I don't want to understand. She paused, listening to the soft susurrus of voices that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. They were no longer content to whisper. Now they spoke in conversational tones, overlapping and building into a chorus that made her teeth ache. The bleeding had spread to the ceiling. Thick droplets fell sporadically, landing with soft splashes that echoed far too long in the confined space. Where they struck the floor, the wooden planks had begun to warp and buckle, creating shallow depressions that looked disturbingly organic. Clara closed her journal and pulled her knees to her chest. Outside, the blizzard continued its endless howl, but she was beginning to suspect that the storm was just another symptom of whatever slumbered beneath this place. She'd built her shelter on something that should have remained undisturbed, and now it was waking up. The bleeding walls had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind rust-colored stains that mapped themselves across the timber like diseased veins. Sarah pressed her palm against the wood, feeling for moisture, for warmth, for any rational explanation that might anchor her to sanity. The surface was bone-dry and cold as winter stone. She'd managed perhaps an hour of fitful sleep, jerking awake each time the whispers began their circuit around the shelter's perimeter. Now, in the grey pre-dawn light filtering through the single window, the voices had fallen silent, but their absence felt more ominous than their presence. The axe lay beside her sleeping bag, its handle worn smooth from her grip. She'd clutched it through the long hours, though what good it might do against bleeding walls and phantom voices remained unclear. Still, the weight of it provided a comfort that logic couldn't. Sarah forced herself to eat, jerky that tasted like sawdust, water that sat heavy in her churning stomach. She needed to think clearly, needed to plan. The rational part of her mind, the part that had survived alone on this mountain for 3 years, insisted there had to be explanations. Gas leaks causing hallucinations, some kind of mineral in the soil affecting the wood, maybe even carbon monoxide from the small heating stove. But the rational part was losing ground to the growing certainty that something had gone very wrong when she'd chosen this particular spot to build. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows through the window. Sarah gathered her tools and stepped outside, grateful for the bite of clean air against her face. The forest stretched away in all directions, pristine snow broken only by animal tracks and the scattered debris from her construction work. She walked the perimeter of the shelter, studying the foundation, the walls, the ground itself. Everything looked normal in daylight. Solid, well-built, exactly what she'd intended. But as she rounded the back corner, her foot caught on something hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. Kneeling, she brushed away the white powder to reveal a piece of metal, green with age and corrosion. Her pulse quickened as she cleared more snow, exposing what looked like part of a larger structure buried beneath the earth. The metal was wrought iron, twisted into decorative patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. Sarah fetched her shovel and began digging with methodical determination. The earth was hard-packed but yielded to her efforts, revealing more ironwork, definitely a fence of some kind, though much of it had collapsed or been broken. As she worked, fragments of other materials emerged, pieces of carved stone, rotted wood that crumbled at her touch, and something that made her stomach lurch. Bones, small ones, bleached white and scattered like forgotten toys. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard. A cemetery. She'd built her shelter on top of an old cemetery. The realization should have brought relief, a rational explanation at last for the strange occurrences. Old burial grounds were known to affect the soil chemistry, could explain odd odors, maybe even the discoloration on her walls. But as she stared at the exposed ironwork and scattered remains, relief refused to come. Instead, a deeper unease settled over her like a shroud. There was something deliberate about the way the fence had been broken, the way the grave markers, for that's what those stone fragments had to be, lay scattered and defaced. This wasn't just an old cemetery, this was a desecrated one. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued excavating, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name. The next object she unearthed made her cry out in alarm. It was a skull, but wrong somehow, too elongated, with teeth that seemed too sharp and eye sockets that gaped like accusatory stares. She scrambled backward, dropping the shovel. The skull rolled slightly, and in the shadow of its empty sockets she could have sworn she saw movement, a shifting darkness that seemed to watch her with hungry attention. The whispers started again, faint at first but growing stronger. They seemed to rise from the earth itself, from the exposed grave site, from the very foundations of her shelter. And now, in the clear light of day, she could almost make out words. Welcome, home, so long, so hungry. Sarah ran for the shelter, slamming the door behind her and throwing the bolt. But even as she did, she realized the futility of the gesture. Whatever was speaking to her wasn't outside trying to get in. She'd built her sanctuary, directly on top of it, trapping herself inside with something that had been waiting far longer than she could comprehend. The walls began to bleed again, fresh crimson seeping through the wood grain. But this time, Sarah noticed something that made her blood freeze. The stains weren't random. They were forming patterns, shapes that looked almost like letters, like words written in a script she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The hungry thing beneath her floor was trying to communicate, and it was getting stronger. The axe felt heavier than usual as Sarah hefted it from beside the door, her knuckles white against the worn wooden handle. The bleeding had stopped sometime during the night, leaving dark stains across the logs like old scars, but the whispers hadn't ceased. They'd grown quieter, more insistent, threading through the spaces between her thoughts until she couldn't tell where the voices ended and her own mind began. She needed firewood. The practical necessity anchored her to something real, something she could control. Outside, the wind howled through the pines with a ferocity that made the shelter's walls groan in response. Snow had drifted against the door overnight, and she had to throw her full weight against it to break through the barrier. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. The storm had intensified, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien wasteland of white. She could barely make out the dark shapes of trees through the driving snow, their branches reaching toward her like gnarled fingers. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and trudged toward the woodpile she'd established near a cluster of dead birch trees. Each step sank deep into the powder, making progress exhausting. The whispers followed her outside, carried on the wind or perhaps embedded so deeply in her consciousness. Now the distance meant nothing. Sarah, come back, come home. She swung the axe harder than necessary, splitting a log with such violence that the halves flew in opposite directions. The physical exertion felt good, real, drowning out the voices with the satisfying crack of wood and the burn in her shoulders. She'd learned long ago that hard work could silence the noise in her head, though these whispers felt different from the usual chaos of her thoughts. As she bent to collect the split wood, something caught her eye in the snow, dark spots, like drops of blood, leading away from the shelter and disappearing into the tree line. Sarah straightened slowly, scanning the area around her feet. More spots, and what looked like tracks. But the tracks were wrong. Too large for any animal she knew, with an odd, dragging quality between the footprints, as if something heavy had been pulled through the snow. The blood trail wove between them in a pattern that made her stomach turn. Sarah loaded her arms with firewood and hurried back to the shelter, her eyes fixed on those impossible tracks, until the storm swallowed them from view. Inside, she dropped the wood by the stove with shaking hands and threw the bolt on the door. The familiar weight of the interior pressed around her, but it no longer felt like protection. The fire had burned low while she was outside, and as she knelt to feed it fresh logs, she noticed something that made her freeze. The ashes in the firebox were arranged in patterns, spirals and intersecting lines that definitely hadn't been there before. No random settling of burned wood could create such deliberate shapes. "We've been waiting so long." The voice was clearer now, coming from directly behind her. Sarah spun around, still crouched by the stove, but the shelter was empty. Her supplies hung from their hooks, her sleeping bag lay rumpled where she'd left it, everything exactly as it should be, except for the smell. Something putrid had crept into the air while she was outside, a sweet corruption that reminded her of roadkill left too long in summer heat. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, seeping through the gaps between logs despite the careful chinking she'd done. Sarah forced herself to stand and check the shelter methodically. She examined every corner, every shadow, running her hands along the walls where the bleeding had occurred. The wood felt normal under her touch, solid, dry, unchanging. But when she pressed her ear against one of the logs, she could swear she heard something moving inside it. The afternoon light filtering through the single window had taken on an odd quality, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Sarah found herself avoiding certain parts of the shelter without conscious decision, her body steering clear of the corner where the whispers seemed strongest. She tried to focus on routine tasks, organizing her supplies, checking her water reserves, planning meals from her dwindling stores. But every mundane action felt like performance, as if she were playing the role of a normal person going about normal business while something watched from just beyond perception. As darkness approached, the whispers grew more insistent. They seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, overlapping conversations in a language she almost but not quite understood. Sarah lit her lantern early and kept the fire burning bright, surrounding herself with as much light as possible. But light couldn't touch whatever was sharing the shelter with her. She could feel it moving through the walls, patient and hungry, testing the boundaries of whatever held it back. And with each passing hour, those boundaries seemed to grow thinner. The bleeding had stopped, but the stains remained like accusatory fingers pointing down the walls. Sarah sat cross-legged on her sleeping bag, the axe balanced across her knees, watching the dark patches that seemed to pulse in the firelight. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, maybe more. Time had become elastic in this place, stretching and contracting like the shadows that moved without any source to cast them. The whispers had evolved. What started as formless susurration now carried fragments of words, syllables that almost made sense before dissolving into static. Sometimes she caught her name threaded through the sounds, spoken in voices that felt familiar in ways that made her skin crawl. "Sarah, Sarah, come deeper." She gripped the axe handle tighter. The blade caught the firelight, throwing orange reflections across the ceiling beams she'd cut and shaped with such care just days ago. Now those same beams seemed to sag under an invisible weight, as if the shelter were slowly being pressed down by something massive and patient. The fire popped, sending sparks up toward the makeshift chimney. In that brief flare of light, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. Scratches in the wood above her head, fresh gouges that definitely hadn't been there before. They formed patterns almost like letters, carved deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath the bark. She stood slowly, raising the lantern. The scratches spelled out words in jagged, uneven strokes built on bones. "What bones?" she whispered to the empty air, then immediately regretted speaking. Her voice seemed to hang in the darkness longer than it should have, echoing back distorted. The answer came not in words, but in sensation. The floor beneath her feet shifted almost imperceptibly, and she felt rather than heard a grinding sound, like massive stones settling. She knelt and pressed her ear to the wooden planks she'd so carefully laid. Below, something vast creaked and groaned. Not wood, not earth, but something else entirely. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and crowbar. If there was something under the shelter, she needed to know what it was. The floorboards came up easier than they should have, as if they wanted to be removed. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness below and illuminated a sight that sent ice racing through her veins. Bones. Not scattered remnants or ancient fragments, but an entire skeleton, massive beyond comprehension. What she could see appeared to be a rib cage, each bone thick as a tree trunk and longer than her entire body. They curved away into the darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of her light. The shelter, her carefully planned, precisely built shelter, sat directly on top of this ossified giant. The whispers rose to a crescendo, no longer attempting to form words but unleashing pure emotion, hunger, rage, and something else. Gratitude. Whatever lay beneath was grateful she'd awakened it. Sarah scrambled backward, but her foot caught on one of the loose boards. She tumbled, landing hard against the far wall. The impact sent vibrations through the entire structure, and the bones below responded with a sound like grinding millstones. The whispers cut off abruptly, replaced by something worse, breathing, slow, deep inhalations that seemed to draw the very air from the shelter. The fire guttered and nearly died. In the wavering light, the walls themselves began to change. What she'd assumed was bleeding wood revealed its true nature. The red wasn't seeping from the logs, it was welling up from beneath, flowing through gaps in the floorboards and running down the walls like arteries feeding a massive heart. She understood now why the ground had seemed so perfect for building, why the trees had fallen so easily in just the right directions. This place wanted to be disturbed. It had been waiting, perhaps for decades, for someone to come and break the seal that held it dormant. The breathing grew stronger, and with each exhalation the temperature in the shelter dropped. Her breath came out in visible puffs now, and frost began forming on the windows she'd been so proud of just yesterday. The bones below shifted again, and she felt the entire structure lift slightly, as if something enormous was stirring beneath them. Sarah pressed herself against the door, but when she tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. Not stuck, simply unresponsive, as if the metal had fused solid. The windows showed only impenetrable darkness beyond. No stars, no moon, nothing but black that seemed to press against the glass. She was trapped inside with something that had been waiting to wake up, and her shelter had become its chrysalis. The ancient bones below creaked and ground against each other with increasing frequency, and she realized with growing horror that whatever lay beneath wasn't just stirring, it was beginning to rise. The whispers returned, but now they came from below, seeping up through the gaps in the floorboards with voices older than memory. "Thank you for the door, Sarah. Thank you for the way out." The bleeding had stopped, but the stains remained like accusatory fingers pointing down the cabin walls. Sarah pressed her back against the door, feeling the rough wood dig into her shoulder blades as she stared at the dark patches that seemed to pulse in the flickering candlelight. 3 days had passed since she'd first seen the blood seep through the timber, and sleep had become a foreign concept. Her water supply dwindled to less than a gallon. The jerky she'd packed sat untouched in her stomach's constant state of nausea. Every time she closed her eyes, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, speaking in a language that predated human speech, yet somehow made perfect sense to the primitive part of her brain that still remembered what it meant to be prey. The scratching had evolved too. What started as subtle scraping now sounded like claws dragging deliberately across the inner walls, following a pattern she couldn't quite decipher but felt in her bones. Sometimes it moved in circles, sometimes in long, straight lines that made her think of ancient script being carved into her sanctuary. She'd tried to leave twice. Both times, the door had refused to budge, though the latch moved freely and nothing blocked it from the outside. The windows remained stubbornly sealed despite her best efforts with the hatchet. Even when she'd managed to crack the glass, her hands passed through empty air where the opening should have been, meeting solid resistance that made no sense to her rational mind. The thing wanted her here. She understood that now. On the 4th morning, Sarah woke to find symbols etched into the floor around her sleeping bag. They hadn't been there when she'd laid down, and the wood showed no signs of fresh cutting, as if the markings had simply materialized from within the grain itself. The designs hurt to look at directly, causing her vision to blur and her temples to throb with a pain that felt like something trying to push its way out of her skull. She stumbled away from the symbols, knocking over her water container in her haste. The precious liquid spread across the floor, and where it touched the strange markings, it began to bubble and steam. The acrid smell of burning copper filled the air, and Sarah watched in horror as the water turned black, then red, then something that wasn't quite either color, but somehow both. Sarah. Her name spoken in her own voice, but wrong somehow, as if something else was wearing her vocal cords like an ill-fitting coat. The sound came from directly behind her, and she spun around to find nothing but empty air and dancing shadows. "You built well," the voice continued, and now it seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Strong foundation, good bones, it will serve. What do you want?" she whispered, surprised by how hoarse her voice sounded. When had she last spoken aloud? The laughter that answered her question seemed to bubble up from the earth itself, vibrating through the floorboards and into her feet. "Want? I am. You invited. You built my prison into freedom. Clever hands but foolish mind." Sarah's thoughts raced back to the construction, trying to understand. She'd been so careful with the foundation, making sure it was level and secure, but she'd also dug deep, deeper than necessary, driven by some compulsion she'd attributed to perfectionism. The hole had seemed to want to be deeper, and she'd obliged without questioning why. "The bones," she breathed, remembering the fragments she'd dismissed as animal remains. They weren't animal bones, were they? Offerings, sacrifices, meals. The voice grew stronger, more solid, fed to me piece by piece, century by century, until the feeding stopped and I grew thin, weak, bound by their final ritual to the place of my hunger. The temperature in the cabin plummeted, and Sarah's breath began to fog. Ice crystals formed on the windows, creating patterns that looked disturbingly similar to the symbols on the floor. "You dug deep. You broke the seal. You built me a body of wood and stone and human intention." Something brushed against her shoulder, invisible but undeniably present. "Now I am strong again, strong enough to wear flesh instead of timber." Sarah felt a pressure building in her chest, as if something was trying to expand inside her ribcage. Her vision began to dim around the edges, and she realized with crystalline clarity what was happening. The entity didn't just want her trapped here, it wanted her body, her life force, everything that made her human. She lunged for the hatchet, grasping it with numb fingers as the invisible presence pressed closer. The whispers rose to a crescendo, no longer words but pure malevolent intention flooding her mind. The symbols on the floor began to glow with their own sickly light, and Sarah felt her strength ebbing away like water through a broken dam. But in the growing darkness, one thought burned bright and fierce. She wasn't dead yet, and she wasn't giving up without a fight. The axe handle slipped in her blood-slicked palms as another wave of whispers crashed against her mind. Sarah pressed her back against the door, feeling the wood pulse beneath her shoulder blades like living tissue. The thing that had been her shelter breathed around her, walls expanding and contracting in a rhythm that matched no earthly heartbeat. The scratching had stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah could hear her own ragged breathing and the wet dripping that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The lantern's flame guttered, throwing wild shadows that moved independently of their sources. She watched, transfixed with horror, as the shadows began to detach themselves from the walls entirely, sliding across the floor like oil slicks seeking prey. "Found you," the voice whispered, and this time it came from directly behind her. Sarah spun around, axe raised, but there was nothing there except the door. The wood had turned black, veins of something darker than night pulsing beneath its surface. As she watched, the grain began to shift and writhe, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Ancient symbols that predated human language, carved not into the wood but growing from within it like some cancerous script. The temperature plummeted. Her breath came out in white puffs that hung in the air longer than they should have, twisting into shapes that almost resembled faces before dissolving. The blood on the walls began to freeze, crackling like breaking ice, and Sarah realized with growing dread that the cold wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below. The floorboards beneath her feet had grown soft, spongy, giving way slightly with each step. She looked down to see dark liquid seeping up between the planks, but it wasn't blood. This was something older, thicker, with an oily iridescence that reflected colors that shouldn't exist. The smell hit her then, earth and decay and something else, something that made her stomach clench with primal revulsion. "You built me a beautiful cage," the voice said, seeming to come from the liquid itself. "But cages work both ways, don't they?" Sarah backed toward the center of the shelter, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed closer now, the ceiling lower. The space was contracting around her like a closing fist. She raised the axe and swung at the nearest wall with all her strength. The blade bit deep into the wood with a wet, tearing sound that was nothing like chopping timber. The wall screamed. The sound wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal. It was the voice of something that had never been either, something that existed in the spaces between definitions. Sarah jerked the axe free, and instead of sap or splinters, thick black ichor poured from the wound. The liquid moved with purpose, flowing upward against gravity to form more of those writhing symbols. The shadows were moving faster now, circling her like sharks. She could see shapes within them, not quite formed, but suggesting things that might once have been human before something fundamental had been taken away. They reached for her with appendages that weren't quite arms, and where they touched, the air itself seemed to wither. "What are you?" Sarah gasped, swinging the axe in wide arcs to keep them at bay. "I am what remains," the voice replied, and now she could see it forming in the pooling darkness at her feet. A face that was almost human, features shifting like smoke. "When your kind first learned to build, to cage the wild things, they built over us, buried us, forgot us, but we remembered." The shelter shuddered, and Sarah heard the sound of something massive moving beneath the floorboards. The soft wood began to buckle and split, revealing glimpses of what lay below. Not earth, but a vast hollow space filled with writhing darkness. And in that darkness, shapes moved. Many shapes, far too many. "One by one we take them," the thing continued, its voice now coming from every surface at once. "The builders, the cagers, we show them what it means to be trapped, to be forgotten, to hunger in the dark." Sarah's legs gave out as the truth hit her. The old maps she'd found, the ones that showed structures scattered throughout these mountains. They weren't marking old homesteads or cabins. They were marking feeding grounds, traps that had been set and reset for centuries, waiting for the next desperate soul to stumble into the wrong place and build their shelter on cursed ground. The lantern finally died, plunging the shelter into absolute darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. It was full of reaching things, hungry things, things that had been waiting so very long for someone to let them in. And Sarah had done more than let them in. She had built them the perfect hunting ground, sealed herself inside with them, given them everything they needed. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her completely was the sound of her own voice, whispering words in a language she didn't know, calling to others who might be foolish enough to build where they shouldn't. The hunger was spreading, and winter was just beginning. The entity's whispers had grown stronger through the night, weaving through her dreams like poisoned silk. Sarah woke to find frost patterns on the walls that hadn't been there before, intricate spirals and angular symbols that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. Her breath came out in visible puffs despite the fire she'd kept burning, and when she reached toward the nearest marking, the ice felt warm beneath her fingertips. The sensation sent her recoiling across the small space, her back hitting the opposite wall with enough force to rattle the entire structure. Something cracked overhead, not wood, but something deeper, more fundamental. The whispers ceased abruptly, as if whatever lurked in the darkness was listening. "I know you're there," she said aloud, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "What do you want?" The silence stretched until she wondered if she'd imagined everything. Then, slowly, deliberately, the frost patterns began to shift. The spirals unwound themselves, the angular symbols rearranging into something that made her stomach lurch with recognition. Not words exactly, but meaning that bypassed language entirely and carved itself directly into her consciousness. Hungry, so long. Sarah pressed her palms against her temples, trying to push out the alien thoughts that weren't quite thoughts. The entity's presence felt like ice water in her veins, spreading from her extremities toward her core. Each breath became an effort, each heartbeat a small victory against the creeping cold that wasn't entirely physical. She forced herself to move, to gather the scattered remains of her supplies. The food she'd brought was nearly gone. 3 days of rationing had stretched it thin, and now she faced the grim reality that her original plan of waiting out the storm had become impossible. The weather outside might kill her, but staying here certainly would. As she stuffed items into her pack, her fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. Smooth bone, yellowed with age, carved with the same symbols that now decorated her walls. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her memory. Some places remember what happened to them. The bone was warm, almost feverish, and holding it brought a flood of images that weren't her own. She saw the mountain as it had been centuries ago, saw the rituals performed in clearings that no longer existed, saw the careful boundaries that had once kept certain hungers contained. She watched settlers arrive, ignorant and confident, building where they shouldn't build, disturbing what should have remained undisturbed. She saw herself through ancient eyes, another trespasser, another fool who thought human will could triumph over forces that predated civilization. But there was something else in the visions, a flicker of possibility that made her grip the bone tighter despite the visions it brought. "The bindings can be renewed," whispered a voice that might have been her grandmother's, or might have been something far older wearing that familiar cadence. But the price is always the same. Sarah didn't need to ask what the price was. She could feel it in the bone's fever heat, in the way the entity's hunger seemed to focus on her with increasing intensity. The original bindings had required a sacrifice, someone willing to serve as both jailer and companion to the thing that couldn't be killed, only contained. The walls began to bleed again, thick rivulets of something that was almost but not quite blood. The liquid moved with purpose, forming symbols and patterns that hurt to look at directly. The entity was growing stronger, feeding off her fear and her presence, preparing for something that would make her previous encounters seem gentle by comparison. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but Sarah could hear something else beneath the wind. Footsteps, perhaps, or the sound of something large moving through the snow. The entity's whispers returned, excited now, anticipatory. Others come, others always come. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by voices she couldn't quite make out. Rescue, perhaps, or other unfortunates drawn by the same forces that had guided her to this place. The entity's hunger sharpened, becoming almost sexual in its intensity, and Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that she was about to witness the purpose for which she'd been gathered here. She wasn't the sacrifice. She was the bait. The bone in her hand pulsed with each approaching footstep, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with their own sick light. Whatever was coming had perhaps an hour before they reached her shelter, drawn by warmth and light and the promise of safety from the storm. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a mantle made of lead. She could warn them, could try to drive them away and face the entity's wrath alone. She could flee into the storm and leave them to discover what she'd awakened, or she could accept the role that fate and ancient hungers had chosen for her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, promising power and survival and an end to loneliness that would last until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. The blood had stopped flowing down the walls, but the stains remained like accusatory fingers pointing toward the shelter's heart. Sarah pressed herself against the door, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she stared at the symbol carved into the opposite wall. It seemed to pulse in the firelight, the ancient lines shifting and writhing as though alive. The whispers had grown bolder since she'd spoken its name aloud. They no longer hid in the corners or skulked behind the wind's howl. Now they circled her openly, a chorus of voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Some sounded almost familiar, fragments of words that tugged at memories she didn't possess. "You know us," they seemed to say. "You've always known us." Sarah's fingers found the knife at her belt, though she understood its uselessness against whatever shared this space with her. The blade felt cold and foreign in her grip, a relic from a world where steel could solve problems and walls meant safety. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the blood-stained logs. In those moving shapes, Sarah began to see forms, tall, angular beings with too many joints and eyes like burning coals. They moved with purpose, reaching toward her with fingers that stretched impossibly long. She blinked hard, and the shadows returned to their natural shapes. But the sensation of being watched remained, pressing against her skin like a physical weight. The temperature had dropped again. Her breath misted in the air despite the fire's warmth, and frost began forming along the edges of the symbol. As the ice spread, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Join us, daughter of the mountain. Take your place among the eternal." Sarah stumbled toward the fire, desperate for its heat, but stopped short when she saw what lay in the flames. Faces stared back at her, dozens of them, all bearing her features, but aged beyond recognition. Some were skeletal, others merely ancient, but all wore the same expression of infinite hunger. "No," she whispered, backing away. "I won't become you." The laughter that answered her shook the shelter's foundation. Tools fell from their hooks, and the carefully stacked firewood scattered across the floor. The symbol on the wall blazed with cold light, its lines now clearly visible as something carved not into the wood, but into reality itself. Sarah's vision blurred, and suddenly she was standing in the same spot, but the shelter around her had changed. The walls stretched higher, disappearing into darkness above. The single room had become a vast chamber filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. In the distance, she could see other fires, countless tiny flames that marked other shelters, other traps built by the unwary. And around each fire stood a figure, a person who had made the same mistake she had. They turned toward her in unison, their faces gaunt with eternal hunger, their eyes reflecting the same cold light that emanated from the symbols carved into their walls. "Welcome," they said as one voice. "We've been waiting so long for you to join us." Sarah tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She looked down and saw roots emerging from the floorboards, wrapping around her ankles like grasping fingers. They pulled her deeper into the wood until she stood knee-deep in the floor itself, becoming part of the shelter's structure. The other figures began to approach, walking across the vast space with slow, deliberate steps. As they drew closer, Sarah could see that they weren't entirely human anymore. Their bodies had adapted to their eternal imprisonment, growing thin and angular to better navigate the spaces between walls. Their fingers had elongated into tools for carving symbols and collecting the blood that fed their captors. "It doesn't hurt after the first century," one of them said, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "You learn to appreciate the hunger. It becomes all you know, all you need." Sarah felt the change beginning in her own body. Her fingers ached as they stretched, her spine cracked as it lengthened, and her vision sharpened until she could see clearly in the absolute darkness that existed between the fires. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance remained. She thought of the mountains outside, of the clean snow and honest wind. She remembered the feel of good earth under her hands and the satisfaction of work done with her own strength. "I am not your daughter," she said, her voice carrying across the impossible space. "I am Sarah Chen, and I built my shelter with my own hands." The advancing figures paused, uncertainty flickering in their ancient eyes. "I chose this place," Sarah continued, feeling strength returning to her voice, "but I can choose to leave it." The roots around her legs tightened, and the symbol on the wall pulsed with angry light. The whispers rose to a shriek that threatened to shatter her sanity. But Sarah had made her decision. She raised her hand to the rope that hung from her belt, the rope she'd brought to secure her shelter against the mountain winds. It was time to test its strength. The blessed silence lasted only 3 heartbeats before the thing in the walls began to laugh. Sarah pressed herself against the door, the iron poker trembling in her grip as the sound echoed from everywhere at once, a wet, bubbling mirth that seemed to seep from the very wood itself. The symbols she'd carved with Marcus's knife had stopped glowing, leaving only thin black lines that looked more like wounds than protection. "You think your grandfather's scratches can hold me?" The voice came from directly behind her ear, though nothing was there. "I was ancient when he was learning to crawl." Sarah spun, swinging the poker through empty air. The laughter intensified, and she realized with growing horror that it was coming from her own mouth. She clamped her hands over her lips, but the sound continued, vibrating through her skull like an infection. The walls began to pulse again, but differently this time. Where before they had merely bled, now they seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched her own panicked heartbeat. The shelter was becoming something alive, something that had digested her grandfather's warnings and her mother's stories, and was now preparing to digest her. "Sarah!" Her mother's voice drifted from the corner where the bleeding was heaviest. "Sarah, honey, why didn't you listen?" She turned toward the sound, knowing it was a trap, but unable to stop herself. In the shifting shadows, she could almost see her mother's face forming in the dark stains, features molded from blood and rot, eyes that were holes leading to somewhere vast and hungry. "I tried to tell you," her mother's voice continued, growing stronger as the face became clearer, "about the old places, about what sleeps beneath the mountain, but you were always so stubborn. You're not real." Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. "She's dead. You killed her." "Did I?" The thing wearing her mother's voice tilted its impossible head. "Or did she simply come home? This is where we all come home, Sarah, where the mountain keeps us." The shelter shuddered, and Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Looking down, she saw that the wooden planks were no longer wood, but something pale and yielding that gave slightly under her weight. "Bone," her mind whispered. "You're standing on bone." She stumbled backward, and her shoulder hit the wall. The surface was warm and wet, and she could feel it pulse against her back like a massive heart. When she pulled away, her coat was stained with something dark and thick. "Look around you," the entity commanded, its voice now coming from multiple directions at once. "Really look." Against her will, Sarah's eyes adjusted to reveal the true nature of her shelter. The walls were not walls but ribs, massive, ancient ribs that curved overhead to form a ceiling of interlocked bone. The bleeding wasn't coming from wood but from the spaces between vertebrae, from joints where cartilage still held prehistoric bones together. She was inside something vast and dead, and yet somehow still aware. "The mountain's first guardian," the voice explained with satisfied pleasure, "died protecting this place from your kind thousands of years ago. But death isn't the end here, little builder. Death is just another kind of sleep." The ribs began to close, the ceiling lowering as the creature's ancient chest cavity slowly contracted. Sarah dropped to her knees, then to her stomach as the space compressed around her. The iron poker was useless now. What could it do against something this immense? "Your grandfather knew," the voice continued as the bones ground together overhead. "Knew what he'd found when he was young and foolish like you. But he was smart enough to run, smart enough to warn others to stay away." Sarah's breathing came in short gasps as the space grew smaller. Soon she would be crushed, ground up like food in some primordial stomach. But as the panic reached its peak, her fingers brushed against something in her pocket, something she'd forgotten in her terror. Her grandmother's lighter, the one her mother had left with the journals. With trembling hands, she pulled it out and flicked the wheel. The flame that sprang to life was impossibly bright in the crushing darkness, and where its light touched the ancient bones, They recoiled with a sound like screaming wind. "Clever girl," the entity hissed, and for the first time she heard something like uncertainty in its voice. "But fire dies, and I am patient." The ribs stopped closing but didn't retreat. Sarah held the lighter higher, watching the flame dance in the darkness. The fuel wouldn't last forever, maybe 10 minutes if she was lucky, but in that small circle of light, pressed between bones older than human memory, she finally understood what her grandfather had really discovered on this mountain. Not just something hungry, something that had been feeding for millennia, growing stronger with each life it claimed, each soul it added to its collection. And now it wanted her to complete the feast it had started with her family generations ago. The entity's voice had changed. What began as whispers now carried weight, substance, as if the thing was learning to inhabit the very air around her. Clara pressed herself against the far wall of the shelter, watching the shadows writhe and pulse with unnatural life. "You cannot leave," it said, the words seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "We are bound now, you and I. Blood calls to blood." The cuts on her palms throbbed in response, and Clara realized with growing horror that the bleeding hadn't stopped. Dark rivulets continued to seep from the wounds, more than should have been possible from such shallow cuts. The blood didn't drip to the floor. Instead, it moved upward along her arms in thin streams, defying gravity as it sought the walls. "What do you want?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would be something she couldn't give. The temperature plummeted. Her breath came out in violent puffs as frost began forming on the inside of the walls, creating intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like reaching hands. The entity's laughter was the sound of ice cracking under pressure. "I want what was taken from me, what your kind stole when they buried me beneath stone and earth." The shadows coalesced into a more solid form, still indistinct but undeniably there. "I want to feel the sun again, to walk among the living, to taste warm flesh and hot blood." Clara's mind raced. The locals' warnings echoed in her memory. Stories of something that had terrorized the mountain communities generations ago, something that had been contained rather than destroyed. She had built her shelter directly over its prison. "The missing hikers," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You've been feeding on them." Scraps, morsels thrown down to a starving animal. The entity's form shifted, growing larger, more defined. "But you invited me in. You gave me your blood willingly, even if unknowingly. You are the key I have waited so long to turn." The walls began to bleed more freely now, thick crimson streams that pooled on the floor around her feet. The metallic smell was overwhelming, making her gag. But worse than the sight or smell was the realization that some of it was hers, her blood drawn from those cursed cuts, feeding whatever dark ritual was taking place. Clara stumbled toward her pack, searching for anything that might help. Her grandfather's journal lay at the bottom, its leather cover now warm to the touch. She pulled it out with trembling fingers, and the pages fell open to an entry she had never seen before, written in ink that seemed to shimmer and move. The handwriting was definitely her grandfather's, but the words chilled her to the bone. "If you are reading this, then you have found what I tried to hide. The thing that sleeps beneath the black rock was not meant to be disturbed. I thought I could study it, learn from it, but I was wrong. The only mercy is that it cannot leave the place where it was bound, unless someone gives it passage through blood and bone." Below the entry was a crude map of the area, with her exact location marked by a symbol that looked like a tree whose roots had been set on fire. "Your grandfather was weak," the entity hissed, apparently able to read her thoughts now. "He fled when he should have surrendered. But you have nowhere to run." The shelter groaned around them, the walls bowing outward as if something massive was pressing against them from inside. Clara realized the space was expanding, growing larger than the small structure she had built. The entity was reshaping reality itself, creating a domain that existed between worlds. "You're not trapped here with me," she said, finally understanding the true horror of her situation. "I'm trapped here with you. Now you begin to see." The entity's form was becoming more human-like, though wrong in fundamental ways, too tall, with limbs that bent in impossible directions, and features that shifted whenever she tried to focus on them. Soon I will have enough strength to wear your skin as my own, to walk in the world above and feed as I please. Clara clutched the journal tighter, feeling its warmth spread through her hands. There had to be something else, some way her grandfather had planned for this moment. The entity might have all the time in the world, but she was still human, still capable of choices it couldn't predict. The bleeding walls pulsed with renewed vigor, and she could feel her life force being drawn out with each drop. But she also felt something else, a connection forming, fragile but real. If blood had bound them together, perhaps blood could also be the key to breaking free. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Clara no longer heard it. The only sounds were the entity's breathing and her own racing heartbeat, marking time until one of them claimed victory. The whispers had become a constant murmur now, like water running over stones, and Sarah could no longer tell if they came from the walls or from inside her own skull. She pressed her back against the door, watching the crimson stains spread across the timber like ink through paper. The thing that wore her father's face stood in the center of the room, patient as death itself. "You can't keep running, little bird," it said, tilting its head at an angle no living neck should manage. "There's nowhere left to go." Sarah's fingers found the iron nail in her pocket, the metal warm against her skin. The journal had mentioned iron, something about old barriers and older protections. She pulled it out, holding it like a talisman between them. The thing that looked like her father laughed, a sound like branches breaking. "Iron, oh child, you think such simple things can bind what walks between the roots and stones? I am older than your metal, older than your kind's first fearful scratching in the dirt." But Sarah noticed how it didn't come closer, how its eyes, too dark, too deep, fixed on the nail with something that might have been wariness. "What are you?" she whispered. "I'm hunger given form. I am the dark that waits beneath every foundation, the cold that seeps through every wall." It spread its arms wide, and Sarah saw how the shadows moved with it, flowing like liquid. "I am what your ancestors knew to fear, before they forgot the old ways and grew careless with their building." The bleeding walls pulsed, and Sarah realized she could see veins beneath the timber now, a network of arteries that fed something vast and patient. The shelter wasn't just built over this thing's resting place, it had become part of it, transformed into something between sanctuary and stomach. "The others who came before," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the whispers. "The family who built here first, what happened to them?" "They fed me well." The creature's smile was her father's, but wrong in every detail. The mother's despair was sweet, the children's terror exquisite. But the father... It paused, seeming to savor some memory. The father fought longest. His rage was nourishing. Sarah thought of the bones she'd found, the scratch marks in the stone foundation. A family, trapped as she was trapped, slowly consumed by something that wore familiar faces and spoke with beloved voices. "But they were weak," the creature continued, circling her now like a predator, soft with easy living. "You're different, aren't you? Mountain-born, mountain-raised, your fear has a different flavor, wilder, sharper. It will sustain me through many winters." The iron nail seemed to pulse in Sarah's grip, warm and somehow alive. She thought of her real father, the man who'd taught her to read the mountains, to understand their moods and dangers. He would have known better than to build here, would have felt the wrongness in the very stones. "You made a mistake," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. The creature paused, tilting its borrowed head. "Did I?" "You showed me my father." Sarah stood straighter, the nail growing warmer in her fist. "But my father would never have stood by and watched me suffer, never would have mocked my fear. You made him wrong." Something flickered across the creature's face, surprise perhaps, or annoyance. "Fear makes fools of memory, little bird. You see what terror shows you." "No." Sarah stepped forward, and this time the creature retreated a half step. I see what you want me to see, but you don't understand what you're wearing. My father was kind, gentle. Even when he was angry, he was never cruel. The creature's form wavered, edges blurring like smoke. Clever girl, but understanding changes nothing. You are still trapped, still mine to consume. Sarah looked around the shelter, at the bleeding walls, the shadows that moved with their own purpose, the timber that pulsed like living flesh. The creature was right. Understanding its nature didn't free her from its trap. But the journal had mentioned something else, something about willing sacrifice and unwilling prey, about how the old things were bound by older rules. I challenge you, she said, the words coming from some deep instinct she didn't fully understand. The creature went very still. Even the whispers faded to nothing. What did you say? Sarah gripped the iron nail tighter, feeling its warmth spread up her arm. I challenge you, face me as you truly are, not wearing stolen shapes. If I win, you let me go. If you win, she swallowed hard. If you win, I stop fighting. I feed your hunger willingly. The creature stared at her for a long moment. Then it began to smile with her father's mouth, an expression of pure, malevolent joy. Oh, little bird, it whispered, you have no idea what you've just done. The creature's roar shattered the silence as Maya's improvised torch illuminated the chamber's true horror. The walls weren't bleeding, they were digesting. Centuries of victims had been absorbed into the living rock, their faces pressing against the surface like trapped swimmers beneath ice. Their mouths moved in silent screams, eyes tracking her movement with desperate awareness. The entity before her defied comprehension. It stood 12 feet tall, its form constantly shifting between shadow and substance. Ancient antlers crowned a skull that seemed carved from midnight, while multiple arms emerged and dissolved from its torso like smoke given malevolent purpose. Where its feet should be, tendrils of darkness burrowed deep into the mountain's bedrock, as if it were both parasite and part of the stone itself. You cannot leave, it spoke without moving its jaw, the voice echoing from the walls themselves. None leave, all feed the mountain, all become the mountain. Maya's torch flickered, the flames dancing frantically as if trying to escape. She pressed her back against the chamber's entrance, feeling the rough stones scrape through her torn jacket. The ritualistic circle beneath the creature pulsed with that sickly bioluminescence, and she could see now that the symbols weren't carved. They were burned into the rock by countless years of suffering. The indigenous warnings, she whispered, pieces falling into place. They knew what lived here. The creature's head tilted, antlers scraping against the ceiling. The old ones were wise. They fed me willingly, keeping me satiated with ceremony and sacrifice. But they are gone, and I have been hungry. Maya thought of the research she'd done before choosing this location, how she'd dismissed the local legends as superstition. The Blackfoot had called this place Nappy's prison, where the trickster god had bound something that should never have existed. She'd laughed at the stories, convinced that her rational mind was superior to ancient wisdom. The torch sputtered, and in the momentary darkness, the creature moved closer. When the light returned, it loomed directly over her, close enough that she could feel the wrongness radiating from its form like Arctic wind. Your shelter was well built, it continued, almost conversationally. The stones you chose, the placement of your walls, you trapped yourself as thoroughly as any snare. The mountain recognizes its own. Maya's mind raced. The stones. She'd selected them carefully, looking for the flattest, most stable pieces, but she remembered now how certain rocks had seemed to call to her, how her hands had been drawn to specific formations without conscious thought. The entity hadn't been trapped by her construction. It had guided her to trap herself. You influenced my choices, she said, understanding dawning like cold sunrise. The location, the materials, everything. I whispered in your dreams long before you arrived. Lonely women hear voices so clearly, especially those running from ghosts. The creature's laugh was the sound of grinding stone. Your dead husband calls to you still, doesn't he? The guilt gnaws like hunger. Maya's breath caught. Images of David flashed through her mind. His final argument, the way he'd stormed out into the blizzard, how she'd let pride keep her from following until it was too late. The creature fed on more than flesh. It devoured guilt, regret, the deepest wounds of the human soul. "David's death wasn't your fault," she said aloud, as much to herself as in defiance of the entity. "And I won't let you twist that pain into food." The creature recoiled slightly, its form wavering. "Your guilt sustains me. Your isolation called to me across the valleys. You built this prison because you believe you deserve it." Maya felt the truth in those words, but also recognized the manipulation. She had come here to hide, to punish herself with solitude, but she'd also come to heal, to find strength in the wilderness that had always been her sanctuary. The creature had tried to corrupt that healing into self-destruction. The torch was dying. In moments, she would be alone in absolute darkness with this ancient horror. But Maya noticed something. When she'd spoken David's name without guilt, when she'd refused to accept blame, the creature had weakened. The faces in the walls had stirred with something like hope. "You're not just hungry," she realized. "You're desperate. How long since someone fought back? How long since someone refused to feed your appetite for human suffering?" The entity's roar filled the chamber, but there was panic in it now. The bioluminescent circle flickered like a dying heartbeat. Maya's torch guttered out, plunging them into darkness. But in that darkness, she heard something new, not whispers of despair, but voices of those trapped in the walls, calling out in languages she didn't understand but somehow comprehended. They weren't just victims anymore, they were showing her the way out. In the absolute blackness of the mountain's heart, Maya smiled for the first time in months and took a step forward. The entity's laughter echoed through the collapsing shelter as Sarah pressed herself against the splintering wall, her makeshift torch flickering weakly in her trembling hand. Blood seeped through every crack in the wood, pooling at her feet in sticky crimson puddles. The ancient thing she'd trapped, or that had trapped her, was growing stronger with each passing moment. "You cannot leave," it whispered from everywhere at once, its voice like grinding stone. "Not now. Not when you fed me so well with your fear." Sarah's mind raced through everything she'd learned in the past horrific days. The shelter wasn't built on cursed ground. It was built over a deliberate prison. The strange symbols carved into the foundation stones weren't decorative. They were warnings, seals, barriers that her construction had systematically destroyed. The walls groaned and buckled inward. Through the gaps, she glimpsed writhing shadows that defied the laws of physics, reaching toward her with fingers made of solidified darkness. Her torch sputtered, and in that moment of near-extinguished light, she saw it clearly for the first time. The entity wasn't formless. It had a shape, humanoid but wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate a person from a half-remembered nightmare. Its skin was the color of old blood, stretched too tight over bones that bent at impossible angles. Where its face should have been, there was only a gaping maw filled with teeth like obsidian shards. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the thing crooned. "This is what I've become after centuries of hunger. What I'll help you become." Sarah forced herself to think past the terror. The old woman's journal had mentioned something else, something about the mountain's history that she'd dismissed as folklore. Indigenous peoples had avoided this peak, calling it the Sleeper's Crown, but there had been others much later, settlers who'd tried to build here and vanished, always in winter, always when they were trapped and isolated. "You're not the first," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. The entity's laughter grew louder. "No. There have been so many over the decades, each one adding their essence to mine, making me stronger." "You built well, Sarah. Better than most. These walls will hold long enough for the process to complete." The bleeding walls pulsed like a heartbeat. Sarah realized with growing horror that the shelter had become more than a prison. It was transforming into something alive, a cocoon, and she was the final ingredient needed for whatever metamorphosis the entity was undergoing. But there was something else in the journal, something she'd read by firelight just days ago that seemed like months now. The indigenous warnings hadn't just been about avoiding the peak. There had been specific instructions, rituals for containing things that should never be released: salt, iron, and something else, something about the mountain itself. Sarah's torch flared briefly, illuminating the pile of supplies she'd stacked in the corner. Among them, the bag of rock salt she'd brought for winter ice, the metal tools she'd used for construction, and wrapped in oilcloth, the hunting knife her grandfather had given her. Genuine iron, forged in the old way. "You remember now," the entity hissed, and she could hear genuine concern creeping into its voice. "But knowledge without power is useless. You're too weak, too afraid." Sarah's hand closed around the knife's handle. "Maybe, but I'm also too stubborn to die easy." She grabbed the salt with her free hand and flung it toward the writhing shadows. Where it struck, the darkness recoiled with a sound like screaming wind. The entity's roar of pain and rage nearly shattered her eardrums, but it also revealed something crucial. This thing could be hurt. The walls convulsed, and she could see actual daylight through the widening cracks. Dawn was coming. She'd survived the longest night, but she wasn't free yet. The entity was preparing for one final assault, gathering its strength for a last desperate attempt to complete its transformation. "Iron and salt," she muttered, remembering her grandmother's stories about things that shouldn't exist. And the third ward. Blood. Not the corrupted blood seeping from the walls, but freely given blood from a willing defender. Sarah drew the iron blade across her palm, feeling the sharp bite of pain. Her blood hit the floor and began to smoke where it mixed with the entity's seeping influence. The reaction was immediate and violent. The shelter's walls buckled outward, as if pushed by an enormous fist from within. The entity's scream rose to an inhuman pitch that seemed to shake the very mountain. But Sarah could see the morning light growing stronger through the cracks, and she knew she had one chance, one moment when the ancient wards would be at their strongest and the creature at its most vulnerable. She raised the bloody knife and spoke the words her grandmother had taught her, words in a language that predated the English settlers, predated even the indigenous peoples who'd first encountered this thing. The entity's eyes fixed on her, no longer confident, no longer certain of its victory. The ancient wood groaned as Marla pressed her back against the shelter's wall, feeling the sticky warmth seep through her jacket. The whispers had grown louder, no longer content to hide in the shadows between her thoughts. They spoke in languages that predated human speech, syllables that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. The thing that had once been her grandmother stood in the center of the room, its form shifting like smoke given flesh. Sometimes it wore Clara's familiar face, weathered and kind. Other times, the mask slipped, revealing something far older. Hollow sockets that held starlight, a mouth that opened too wide, fingers that stretched into impossible lengths. "Long enough for what?" Marla's voice cracked, her throat raw from breathing the copper-thick air. The entity smiled, and for a moment it was purely her grandmother, the woman who had taught her to read the mountain's moods, to find water in drought, to survive when others would perish. Then the illusion fractured. To spread, to grow, to remember what was taken from us. It gestured toward the bleeding walls. "Your kind built cities on our bones, churches on our sacred grounds. But here, in this forgotten place, we endure." Marla felt the weight of understanding settle in her chest like a stone. The depression where she'd built her shelter wasn't natural. It was a grave, a prison, a wound in the earth that had been waiting for someone foolish enough to seal it shut with fresh timber and human sweat. "The previous owners," she whispered. "The family that disappeared." "Fed the earth well," the thing agreed. "Their bones still sing beneath your feet, but they were weak, unprepared. Its hollow eyes fixed on her. "You are mountain-born, mountain-raised. You understand sacrifice." The walls pulsed like a heartbeat, and Marla realized the bleeding wasn't random. The crimson streams formed patterns, symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometries that folded in on themselves. The shelter wasn't just a prison anymore. It was becoming something else, a gateway. "I won't let you use me." She pushed herself upright, legs trembling. The entity laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Use you? Child, you are already mine. Have been since the moment you chose this place. Did you think it was chance that led you here? Coincidence that made you build so perfectly above the old foundations? Marla's mind reeled, every decision that had brought her to this moment. Leaving the valley, seeking solitude, choosing this specific plot of land, suddenly felt foreign, as if viewed through someone else's memories. The dreams, she breathed. The plans that came to me so clearly. I whispered them while you slept, shaped your thoughts like clay. The creature began to circle her, its form becoming more solid with each step. You were my hands in the living world, my voice calling the old powers home. The shelter shuddered, and cracks appeared in the walls, not breaks in the wood, but tears in reality itself. Through them Marla glimpsed movement in a darkness deeper than night. Things with too many teeth, shapes that defied comprehension, the hungry dead waiting for their invitation to return. The blood, she said, understanding flooding through her. It's not just bleeding, it's a summoning circle, and you are the final component. The entity reached for her with fingers that stretched like shadows. Your life, freely given in this place of power, will complete what was begun centuries ago. Marla dodged backward, her hand closing around the small hatchet she'd dropped earlier. The steel felt warm against her palm, almost alive. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, the real Clara this time, not the mockery before her. Iron breaks the old contracts, Marla, spills the right kind of blood. The creature hissed as she raised the blade. You cannot destroy what has already claimed you. Maybe not, Marla said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. But I can choose how I'm claimed. She pressed the hatchet's edge to her palm, feeling the metal bite. Her blood fell to the floor, mixing with the ancient stains, but something was different. Where her drops hit, the symbols flickered and dimmed. The whispers rose to a shriek. What are you doing? Taking back what's mine. She squeezed her fist, letting more blood fall. This is my shelter, my choice, my sacrifice. The walls began to shake violently. The cracks in reality sealed themselves with wet, tearing sounds. The entity lunged forward, but its form was already becoming translucent, losing cohesion. You understand nothing, it snarled. You will only delay the inevitable. Then I'll delay it. Marla smiled grimly as the creature faded. That's what we mountain folk do best. We endure. The shelter fell silent except for her ragged breathing and the wind outside. But in that wind, she could hear them waiting. Patient, eternal, hungry. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The ancient hunger pressed against her mind like ice water flooding her skull. Sarah's fingers, slick with her own blood, struggled to maintain their grip on the iron poker as the thing that had once been trapped beneath her shelter rose to its full, impossible height. The walls of her sanctuary had become translucent, revealing the writhing darkness beyond, a void that had waited centuries for someone foolish enough to build above its prison. The whispers had grown into a chorus now, voices in languages that predated human speech, all singing the same terrible song of release. Sarah understood with crystal clarity that she had never been building a shelter. She had been building a key. The entity's form shifted and flowed like liquid shadow given weight, but its eyes, twin points of starlight in the absolute darkness of its face, remained fixed on her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of glaciers cracking, of mountains settling, of time itself groaning under an unbearable load. You freed me, it said, and each word sent vibrations through the floor that she felt in her bones. Such devotion, such perfect ignorance. Sarah backed against what remained of the far wall, her makeshift weapon pathetically small against something that filled the space like smoke fills a jar. The bleeding walls pulsed with a rhythm that matched her thundering heartbeat, and she realized with growing horror that the shelter wasn't just collapsing. It was digesting itself, feeding its substance to the thing she had awakened. The old ones knew, the entity continued, its form rippling closer. They knew to leave this place empty. They felt me dreaming below and chose hunger over hubris. A sound that might have been laughter echoed from somewhere deep within its mass. But humans forget. You always forget. Sarah's grandmother's stories came rushing back. Tales dismissed as superstition about places in the mountains where nothing grew, where animals refused to go, where the very earth felt wrong beneath your feet. She had chosen this spot because it was clear, because it was flat, because it was convenient. She had never wondered why. "What do you want?" she managed to ask, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Want? The entity's form pulsed, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something vast and segmented, like the shell of some cosmic arthropod. "I want what I have always wanted, to finish what was begun when your kind first looked up at the stars and dared to think they understood." The remaining structure groaned around them, and Sarah felt the floor beginning to buckle beneath her feet. Through the dissolving walls, she could see the mountain itself seeming to lean inward, as if the very landscape was being drawn into the entity's influence. The snow that had trapped her here was melting in streams that ran upward, defying gravity as they fed into the growing darkness. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, through desperate plans and impossible hopes. The iron poker in her hands grew warm, then hot, and she looked down to see it beginning to glow with a dull red light. Not from heat, she realized, but from something else, something the entity noticed as well. Its attention focused on the metal with what she could only describe as surprise. "Iron," it said, and for the first time there was something other than ancient confidence in its voice. Forged iron, shaped by human hands and tempered by human will. Sarah gripped the poker tighter, feeling its warmth spread up her arms. She thought of all the hours she had spent at her forge, of every piece she had shaped, of the satisfaction that came from bending metal to her purpose through skill and determination. The entity pulled back slightly, its form becoming less solid. "You feel it too," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You're ancient, but you're not from here. Iron bothers you because it's ours, it's human." The entity's response was a sound like breaking glass, amplified through a canyon. The remaining walls began to collapse in earnest now, but Sarah no longer felt helpless. She raised the poker, now glowing bright enough to cast shadows through the entity's translucent form, and stepped forward. "You made one mistake," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You thought I was just some lost woman who stumbled onto your prison by accident, but I'm not lost. This is my mountain. This is my home. And I built this place with my own hands." The poker blazed like a small sun as Sarah brought it down through the entity's center. The ancient thing's scream shattered what remained of the shelter's roof, sending chunks of wood and metal flying into the night. But Sarah was already moving, already fighting, already proving that sometimes the greatest mistake an ancient horror could make was underestimating the stubborn determination of someone defending their home.